If you clicked on this video because you have some specific questions about his skills or his weapon rankings, or even his artifacts, then you've come to the right place. Xingqiu is basically Virgil from Devil May Cry, and for obvious reasons, if any character has skills similar to a Devil May Cry character, it is automatically considered S tier. Xingqiu does a ton of damage while being off the field, and he also gives your active character a big boost in survivability. Just to explain how broken he is, in a realistic scenario, the skill multiplier from his burst alone does about 2,500%, and if you have his C6, this then increases to around 4,000%. In this guide, I'll tell you every specific detail that you need to know about him, and I can pretty much guarantee that this will answer any questions you might have regarding his abilities, and the same goes for his builds and his combos. Going into his elemental skill, which is called Fatal Rain Screen, first he does 2 damaging sword slashes. Then regardless of whether it hits an enemy or not, it will summon 3 rain swords around him, or 4 if you have his first constellation. These rain swords will persist on swapping characters, and they reduce the damage you take as well as making you resistant to knockbacks. Some additional info about his skill is that it does not count as a shield for things like the Retracing Bolide 4-piece effect, meaning that you won't get any damage bonus from it. Another important detail is that if you take multiple hits at the same time, it will only shatter one sword, but you will still get the damage reduction on all the hits that you take. Moving on to his burst, which is called Rain Cutter. Okay, so think of it as a modified version of his skill. Imagine if you take out the initial sword slashes from the skill, and instead of that, you get a buff that shoots a few rain swords whenever you use your normal or charged attacks. His burst is technically similar to his skill because you still get the same barrier from his skill, which reduces the damage you take and increases your resistance to knockbacks. The only difference is that this barrier does not shatter when you get hit. Also, what happens when you cast his burst while you have his skill barrier active is that his burst will basically override his skill, and this doesn't count as a shatter. So now I'll get into his healing component, which comes from his first Ascension talent. It basically heals you when a rain sword shatters or expires. So if I have 4 rain swords remaining, or 3 if you have him at no constellations, when these rain swords expire, I get healed for 4 times of this 6%. How this healing works when taking multiple hits at once is that, okay, so as I mentioned earlier, taking multiple hits only shatters 1 rain sword at a time, so you only get 1 heal proc even if you take multiple consecutive hits. Lastly, this talent does not work with his burst because the rain swords in your burst will never shatter, and because they don't shatter, your burst will never heal you. His second Ascension talent gives him an additional 20% hydro damage bonus, which is really useful, and his quality of life talent is actually one of the best because it refunds some of the talent books used for crafting, which is basically going to help you save a lot of resin over the long run. Moving on to his constellations, these passives basically turn him into a 5-star character, if not better. His first constellation just increases the number of rain swords for his skill, which becomes a total of 4 instead of 3. And his second constellation increases the duration of his burst by 3 seconds, from 15 to 18 seconds in total. At his fourth constellation, it makes his skill do 50% more damage while his burst is active, but you actually just want to use his skill before his burst anyway, so that you get the energy particles during the cast time of his burst. At Constellation 6, he becomes insanely overpowered, and the pattern of his rain swords become 2, followed by 3 swords, followed by 5 swords. This totals up to 10 swords for every 3 seconds of auto attacking, and realistically, you will be hitting for 12 seconds out of the 18 seconds, so that's like 40 swords. Also, note that there is a mistranslation on his C6. It does not give you 3 energy every time his burst hits an enemy. It actually only gives him 3 energy on every 3rd hit, which is when you see 5 rain swords hitting the enemy. And lastly, energy recharge does not affect this energy gain from his C6. Before I talk about his optimal stat ratios on like what you should build first, he does get attack percent from ascending him. To build him optimally, assuming that you do have the sacrificial sword on him, first you want to get his energy recharge to about 200% without his C6, and with his C6 I think 150% is fine. Without the sacrificial sword, you would want even more energy recharge, maybe like 30% to 50% more. Of course, the amount of energy recharge you need will depend on your playstyle and your team composition, and the number of enemies is also a huge factor. After getting enough energy recharge, you'll want to increase both his attack and his hydro damage bonus. Investing in attack will give you more damage than investing in crit until you reach around 1,800 attack, and you can basically just treat this as the cutoff point for him. Of course, if you have an artifact that lowers your attack by like 100, but it gives you an additional 20% crit rate and 20% crit damage, then obviously use that instead. At the same time, get as much hydro damage bonus as you can, which will mainly come from your goblet and your second Ascension talent, and possibly the Depth of Heart 2-piece if you're not using the 4-piece Noblesse Oblige. The best weapon for Xingqiu will be the Sacrificial Sword, and this is mainly because he gets 4 or 5 energy particles from his skill, and since each particle gives 3 energy, that's basically 12 or 15 energy with the base 100% recharge. When you technically have 2 chances to reset his skill from one cast because his skill does 2 sword slashes. The second would be the Skyward Blade because it has a huge amount of base attack while also giving energy recharge and some crit rate. The third would be the Favonius Sword, but note that it doesn't proc if Xingqiu is not your active character. And if you don't have any of these weapons, the better craftable options would be the Iron Sting as of patch 1.1. The best artifact for him is obviously the Noblesse Oblige 4-piece set, which gives an even bigger boost in damage for your entire party when you use his burst. The alternative to this would be the Noblesse 2-piece with the Depth of Heart 2-piece, and this is for when you have another character with the 4-piece Noblesse Oblige already, then you probably want to go for this instead. Please do not go for the Maiden 4-piece set and use him as your primary healer because what kind of healer requires you to get hit in order to receive heals? Just let him shine in damage and you'll be fine. Okay, so this is my favorite part because these are all my optimal tips for him that I gathered from playing, especially in the last few floors of Spiral Abyss. The first thing that you need to know is that you shouldn't be playing around his skill, and what I mean by this is that, okay, so you should think of his skill mainly as a form of gaining massive energy while doing some additional damage. That's literally just its main purpose, and just because his burst overrides his skill, it doesn't mean that you have to use his skill and then wait for like 15 seconds before using your burst. You'll essentially lose a ton of damage if you play him this way, so just start off with his skill and immediately use his burst. Also, you always want to use his skill before his burst whenever you can, so that you collect the energy particles during the cast time of your burst. This will basically maximize the uptime of his burst, since you can immediately swap to your main damage dealer, and if you're using the Sacrificial Sword and you get the reset, just cast his skill one more time before swapping characters. It's actually up to you to choose who collects the second set of Hydro Energy, so you should just take note of your character's energy levels. There will be times when your burst is ready, but your skill still has 2 seconds left before cooling down, so what you should do is you should always wait for the skill to be ready so that you can maximize his burst uptime. For the last part of this video, I'll talk about his team synergy with other characters, and even though he works well with pretty much any DPS character, some characters do actually have better DPS uptime with Xingqiu's burst. One example would be Tatalia or Child, simply because his normal attacks won't really launch enemies up, or even characters like Klee because her auto attacks are kind of mid-ranged. Other notable mentions are Diluc, whereby you will have some form of control in applying Melt, since Diluc's skill applies pyro damage on demand. As for Katsing, their combination is perfect when fighting big enemies, but against smaller enemies you'll want to try to keep the enemy against the wall before you do your charged attack spam. This is because the normal attacks and charged attacks will easily launch enemies, and the rain swords will actually keep the enemy in the air, which is obviously bad for DPS uptime, so just wait till they fully land on the ground before pressing your auto attacks. And lastly, he basically solves energy issues for Hydro characters, or even characters with a low energy cost like Diluc or Katsing. More specifically, Xingqiu will be your key to solving Child's energy issues, and you will be able to control who collects the Hydro energy particles based on who needs it more. And if you want to know more about optimizing Child, just check out my Pro Tips for Child guide, link in the description. So if this helped you, do hit the like and subscribe to help with the algorithm, and it also tells me that these guides are actually useful for you guys. So that's pretty much it for this video, and of course, thanks for your support.